So, check this out. Carlos Alcaraz was hitting tennis balls before he could even ride a bike. No, seriously. In El Palmar, this tiny Spanish town where everyone knows everyone, there was this cute little skinny kid, barely tall enough to see over the net, already chasing down forehands with the determination of a pro. While most toddlers were busy learning their ABCs, Carlos was learning how to hit a perfect topspin forehand. Imagine that. At just 3 years old, he was already running around the court, while his dad, the director of the local tennis club, stood on the other side, feeding him ball after ball, laughing and watching in disbelief at how naturally this tiny kid moved. And by age 13, he wasn't just good, he was a problem. Carlitos was Spain's junior champion, regularly crushing players who were older, bigger, and way more experienced. Can you imagine walking onto the court, thinking you're going to beat this skinny kid, and then getting demolished in straight sets? That was Carlos, who got the nickname of the Smiling Assassin. And here's something most people don't know. Carlos used to sleep with his racket. He would literally go to bed with it next to him like it was a teddy bear. That's not just love for the game, that's obsession. He once said in an interview, "I couldn't stop thinking about tennis. I wanted to wake up and play, go to school and play, go to sleep and dream about playing." Then came the turning point. By the age of 14, he caught the attention of Juan Carlos Ferrero, a former world number 1 and French Open champion, who immediately knew he had found someone special. Juan Carlos Ferrero didn't just become his coach. He became his mentor, shaping not only Carlos's game but his mindset. Ferrero told anyone who would listen, "This boy can be number 1 in the world." Of course, at first people laughed because, let's face it, Carlos was small, skinny, all raw talent and energy. Nothing like the polished pros dominating the sport. But Juan Carlos Ferrero wasn't joking. He even went on to say Carlos reminded him of Rafael Nadal as a kid, except for one big difference. Carlos was always smiling. The smiling assassin. He enjoys every ball, Juan Carlos said. Even at 6 a.m., in the freezing cold, he's smiling and ready to play. That's not normal. That's special. And Juan Carlos had seen champions up close. He knew what that fire looked like. He later said, "He had this way of looking at you that said, 'Give me the hardest challenge you can find. I want it.'" That's not normal for a 14-year-old. Most kids run away from pressure. Carlos runs toward it. From that moment on, Juan Carlos's mission was clear. Turn this skinny kid into a beast. And Carlos? He was ready to put in the work, smiling the whole time. Fast forward to 2021. Men's tennis is in transition. Federer is done, Nadal is injured, Djokovic looks untouchable. People keep asking, who's next? And then 18-year-old Carlos Alcaraz walks into the US Open and takes out world number 3 Stefanos Tsitsipas in a 5-set epic that has Arthur Ashe Stadium screaming like it's a rock concert. Tennis legend John McEnroe said on air, "This kid is the real deal. He's playing like he's been here 10 years. But just when the world starts talking about him, disaster strikes. 2 days after his biggest win, Carlos steps onto the court for his next match. And something is wrong. His legs feel heavy. His body refuses to cooperate. By the second set, he's in agony. The cramps take over. He can barely move. On one of the biggest stages of his life, with millions watching, the kid who looked unstoppable is suddenly helpless. He tries to keep going, tries to fight through it, but his body gives out. He collapses into his chair, covers his face, and retires from the match in tears. It was heartbreaking. He had gone from the highest high to the lowest low in just 48 hours. He later admitted that walking off that court was one of the saddest moments of his career. He felt embarrassed, frustrated, and completely defeated. In an interview, he said, "I cried in the locker room for a long time. I felt like I had let everyone down. My team, my fans, myself. I didn't want anyone to see me like that, and that was his first brutal lesson. Talent will get you noticed. But without preparation, discipline, and the right mindset, talent will not save you." So Carlos goes back home, shuts out the noise, and goes to work. Not just hitting balls, but transforming himself. He trains harder than ever before, builds muscle, builds endurance, builds a body that can go 5 sets with anyone on tour. And in 2022, he doesn't just come back. He explodes onto the scene. He storms through Miami and wins his first Masters 1000 title. Then he takes Barcelona, like it's his backyard tournament. And then comes Madrid, the tournament that changes everything. In the span of a single week, he does the impossible. Beats Rafael Nadal. Beats Novak Djokovic. And then crushes Alexander Zverev in the final. No one in history had ever done that before in one tournament. Even Nadal, the king of clay himself, had to give the kid his respect. He has everything. Power, speed, passion, Nadal said after their match. If he stays healthy, he will win many, many slams. Suddenly, the tennis world can't stop talking about Carlos. The headlines call him the heir to the big three. Broadcasters start asking, is this the next Nadal? The next Djokovic? The next Federer? Some even wonder if he might be the first Carlos Alcaraz, a new kind of champion who could dominate the next decade. But here's the thing about early fame. It can mess with you. Carlos himself admitted later that the attention got to him. He started to enjoy the spotlight a little too much. The parties, the late nights, the feeling of being on top of the world. Reporters began to notice. One journalist even wrote, "The only thing that can stop Carlos Alcaraz right now is Carlos Alcaraz." And by the end of 2022, the warning signs were there. He was injured again. People started whispering, maybe he's just another young star who peaked too soon. But Carlos wasn't done writing his story. He had so much more to prove. It's the 2022 US Open, a tournament that would test not just his game, but his heart. He grinds through a brutal 5-set marathon against Marin Cilic in the 4th round. Then comes Jannik Sinner in the quarterfinal. And what follows is one of the greatest matches in US Open history. 5 hours and 15 minutes of tennis, so intense it felt like time had stopped. Carlos saves a match point, keeps swinging like a man possessed, and finally wins at 2:50 a.m., the latest finish in US Open history. When the final ball lands out, Carlos collapses on the court as Arthur Ashe Stadium erupts. Patrick McEnroe said what everyone was thinking. That was the best match I have ever seen on this court. Period. But Carlos still isn't done. He beats Francis Tiafoe in another 5-set thriller in the semifinal. And then, in the final, he takes down Casper Ruud. At just 19 years old, Carlos Alcaraz doesn't just win the US Open, he becomes the youngest world #1 in tennis history. The celebrations are wild. Spain is on its feet. The media crowns him as the new face of the sport. It feels like a coronation. But tennis has a funny way of keeping you humble. In 2023, reality came crashing back down. The injuries returned. Not career-ending, but enough to disrupt his rhythm. He misses the Australian Open entirely, sits at home watching rivals win titles, and for the first time since his breakout, the doubts start creeping in. And then comes Wimbledon, the match that will be talked about for years. Carlos steps onto center court to face Novak Djokovic, the man who hasn't lost a match there in 10 years. 10 years. Djokovic is not just the favorite, he's practically unbeatable on that grass. And when Carlos loses the first set 6-1, it looks like this is going to be a painful lesson, not a changing of the guard. But something switches inside him. Carlos doesn't just fight back, he transforms. He starts swinging freely, charging the net, hitting drop shots with a fearlessness that has the crowd gasping. Every game gets louder, the tension rising with every rally. By the 5th set, it feels like the entire sport is holding its breath. And then, the moment that shocks the tennis world, Carlos breaks Djokovic and collapses to the grass in disbelief. The unthinkable has happened. Novak Djokovic's reign over center court is over. Even Djokovic, gracious in defeat, had to acknowledge what just happened. He handled the pressure incredibly well, Djokovic said. It feels like looking in a mirror sometimes. He is that complete. It was more than a win. It was a statement. The kid from El Palmar had just taken the crown on tennis's most sacred court. But as big as that match was, the rivalry the world couldn't stop talking about wasn't Carlos versus Djokovic anymore. It was Carlos versus Jannik Sinner. By 2024, Sinner had taken the #1 ranking away from Carlos, and the two began trading blows all season long. Every match they played felt like a preview of the future. Commentators started saying it out loud. This is the next Federer versus Nadal. We're watching history repeat itself live. And then came the Olympics, a stage unlike any other. Carlos faced Djokovic again, this time not for a title but for a medal. The whole world watching, national pride on the line. But this time, Djokovic didn't just beat him, he dominated him. It wasn't even close. Carlitos admitted later that this loss cut deeper than almost anything in his career. I felt small again, he said. Like I had to start over. But that's what motivated me. And just like that, the storyline shifted again. Carlos was no longer just the smiling prodigy. He was the hunted champion, forced to evolve once more. Which brings us to 2025, the year that cements Carlos Alcaraz as more than just the next big thing. By now, he isn't just playing tennis. He's rewriting the sport's future in real time. Earlier this season, he faced Jannik Sinner in the Roland Garros final, and what happened that day will live forever in tennis history. 5 hours, 29 minutes, the longest French Open final ever. It wasn't just a match, it was a war disguised as clay court chess. Point after point, game after game, both men were sliding, stretching, grinding, trading blistering forehands like their lives depended on it. Every rally felt like a battle, every shot a test of nerve. At one point, after a 30-ball rally that left both players gasping for air, the crowd inside Philippe Chatrier rose to their feet and gave them a standing ovation in the middle of the match. And when it was finally over, when Carlos raised his arms, dropped to his knees, and lifted that trophy, you could see it on his face. This wasn't just a win. This was redemption. This was a statement. This was a fire being lit. Carlos wasn't just collecting titles anymore. He was on a mission to take back the #1 ranking, to silence every doubt, to remind the world exactly who he was. Fast forward to the US Open final. Destiny delivers the matchup everyone had been waiting for: Carlos Alcaraz versus Jannik Sinner. The rematch. The rivalry that has already started defining this generation. The match is chaos in the best way possible. 4 sets of absurd, highlight reel tennis. Rallies so ridiculous that the commentators are laughing on air. At one point, after pulling off back-to-back impossible shots, Carlos and Jannik actually look at each other and smile, because even they can't believe what they just did. New York is electric. The crowd is screaming like it's a heavyweight title fight. And then, in the biggest moments when the match hangs in the balance, Carlos finds that extra gear. The gear that separates champions from everyone else. The gear that turns great players into legends. He breaks Sinner, clenches his fist, lets out a roar that shakes Arthur Ashe Stadium, and when the final ball flies out, Carlos falls to the ground, screaming, punching the air like a man possessed. And just like that, Carlos Alcaraz is the US Open champion again. World #1 again. At just 22 years old, he's already a 2-time US Open champion, a 2-time Wimbledon champion, and a 2-time Roland Garros champion in one of the greatest finals ever played. 6 Grand Slams total. And he's doing it all with that same boyish smile that started it all back in El Palmar. Djokovic is the machine. Nadal is the warrior. Federer was the artist. Carlos? Carlos is all three. A machine, a warrior, an artist, wrapped into one. And the scariest part? This is just the beginning.